morning, everybody. My name is I'm the head of department in the NMHH responsible for international affairs. I'm very glad that all of you could accept our invitation to this event. We believe that it is going to be a very exciting event. The topic is quite relevant, I think, that all the stakeholders in the European telecom industry. In the beginning, I can be very, very short because I'm glad to tell you that we have an excellent moderator for the conference. He's going to act not only as a moderator but as a host. So Magnus will help us to manage this conference, and the only thing I can do now is to hand it over to Magnus and wish you everybody a very nice conference and a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you, Erwin, for the kind introduction. I'm Magnus. I am a journalist in Brussels with a news agency called MLex, which most people haven't heard of. I follow the digital economy from a regulatory and legal point of view, and indeed this is a very timely conference, very interesting, also in the sidelines of what's going to happen in the next few days with the BEREC, which will have interesting discussions, but we can't follow them in public, but we'll find out later what's happening there. I'm basically a glorified timekeeper, so that's my role today. But I will start us off with a few welcome messages and keynotes, and then we'll go straight into a session about what the future might hold for the telecom sector, investment, etc. I'd like to thank NMHH, the Hungarian telecom media regulator, for hosting this in beautiful Budapest. I think we should get started without further ado and hear what our speakers have to say. We're going to start with Dr. Monika, the head of the NMHH, who's going to give us some introductory words in Hungarian, I understand. So I hope you have your earpieces if you don't speak Hungarian. And then we'll go on with Leonidas Kanellos, the head of the Greek regulator, BEREC, and Harald Gruber from the European Investment Bank. But Monika, do you want to start us off with some welcome words?
Tisztelettel köszöntöm Önöket. Lőte szerint a legtöbb, amit a gyermekeinknek adhatunk, gyökerek és szárnyak. A digitális univerzum a 21. század gyermeke, és mi mindannyian a digitális univerzum gyermekei vagyunk.
According to the German Prince of Poets, the most we can give to our children is roots and wings. And the digital universe is the child of the 21st century. And we are all the children of the digital universe.
Gyökerek és szárnyak, vagyis biztonság és képesség a haladásra. Erre minden kezdetkor, minden induláskor szükségünk van.
Roots and wings. That is safety and capability for progress. This is what we need for every start, for every new beginning.
Tisztelt konferencia! Mit jelentenek Goethe szavai a mi területünkön, az európai hírközlés területén? Vagyis mit jelent a biztonság és a haladás képessége, ha a digitális univerzum ősrobbanására gondolunk?
Distinguished audience of the conference, what do the words of Goethe mean in our own field, in the territory of the European telecommunications? What is the meaning of safety, security, and the capability of progress if we can look at the big bang of the digital universe?
Ma, amikor minden, egész földrészeket behálóznak az információs és kommunikációs technológiák, akkor vajon hol találhatóak a gyökerek? Miben rejlik a fogyasztók, az államok, a befektetők és egész európai szektor kiszámíthatósága?
Today, when continents are all covered by the information and communication technologies, where do we find the roots? Where is hidden the predictability of the consumers, of states, investors, and of the whole European sector?
Úgy hiszem, hogy sokan szövetségesként tudnak rám tekinteni akkor, ha azt mondom, hogy a biztos alap a közös európai érdekeket harmonizáló és egyszerre a lokális sajátosságokat is figyelembe vevő szabályozásban van. Mert ahogyan az úthálózat, ugye frekvencia sem ér véget az államhatároknál.
I believe many of you can look at me as an ally when I say that the secure base is hidden in the regulation, harmonizing the shared European values and interests, and also considering at the same time the local features, considering the peculiarities. Just like the road network, frequency doesn't stop at national borders.
Ezért a hírközlés területén nagyon fontos, hogy képesek legyünk az államhatárokat átívelően tervezni, sőt határok nélküli piacokban gondolkodni. Egy konkrét példával élve, ez a fajta gondolkodásmód például nagyon hasznos volt a roaming-díjak egységesítésénél.
Therefore, in the field of telecommunications, it is highly important that we are able to plan cross-border, crossing national borders. What is more, to take in markets without borders, and using a concrete example, this kind of thinking was very useful with the unification of the roaming fees.
Biztos vagyok abban, hogy önök közül mindannyian egyetértenek velem abban, hogy egyedül az európai dimenziója együtt gondolkodás alkalmas arra, hogy növekedésre serkentse az európai piacot.
I am also certain that all of you will agree with me that it is alone the joint thinking in European dimensions which is suitable to stimulate the European market for further growth.
De igaz az is, hogy ahogyan az úthálózat tervezésénél figyelembe kell venni a földrajzi adottságokat, a települések sűrűségét, a már meglévő úthálózat kiépítettségét, vagyis a helyi viszonyokat, úgy a hírközlés fejlesztésénél is tekintettel kell lenni a lokálisan jellemző sajátosságokra.
But it is also true, just when someone is planning a road network, the geographic conditions, the density of communities, and the deployment of the already existing road network, i.e. the local conditions, have to be taken into account. Also in the development of telecommunications, we have to consider the local typical properties.
Mert vannak olyan kérdések, amelyekről helyben kell dönteni. Mert vannak olyan kérdések, ahol nem lehet elvonatkoztatni az eltérő fejlődési szintekről, a helyi sajátosságoktól.
Because there are questions which have to be answered locally. Because there are questions where you cannot abstract from the diverging levels of development and the local features.
Itt is konkrét példával élek, meg kell említeni a frekvencia vagyonnal való felelős gazdálkodás kérdését, ami éppen a felelősség miatt nem szakítható ki a tagállami szintű döntéshozatalból.
Also in this context, using a concrete example, I must speak about the issue of responsible management of the frequency assets, which, because of the responsibility exactly, cannot be torn out of the decision making at the level of the member states.
Visszatérve tehát az alapgondolathoz, azáltal lehetnek stabilak a gyökerek, ha a piac további fejlődése úgy valósul meg, hogy az európai piacokon továbbra is fenntartjuk az egészséges versenyt. Ha ez a szempont teljesül, akkor a folyamat részét képezheti a piaci konszolidáció is.
Returning to the basic concept, the roots can be strong through the implementation of the market by maintaining the healthy competition in the European markets also in the future. If this requirement is satisfied, then market consolidation can also be part of the market process.
Azért fontos az érdekek harmonizációja, azért fontosak az ilyen fórumok, mint amilyen ez is, mert a fejlődés csak biztos közös gyökerekből indulhat ki. Ez pedig csak úgy lehetséges, ha a 21. századi modern hatóságok, a piaci cégek és a befektetők együtt partnerként tekintve egymásra képesek szilárd alapokat teremteni és ezeket érvényesíteni egész Európában.
Harmonization of interests and forums like this one are also important because the development can start only from secure and shared routes. And this is possible only in the way that the modern authorities of the 21st century, the market players and the investors together, they look at each other's partners and are capable of creating solid professional foundations and to assert them throughout Europe.
Abban az Európában, ahol Goethe már a 18. században megfogalmazhatta, hogy a gyökerek mellett a szárnyakra is szükség van. Vajon sejthette Goethe az akkori hírközlési eszközök mellett, hogy a 21. században ilyen fejlődésre lesz lehetőség?
In Europe, where Goethe, already in the 18th century, stated that in addition to roots, people need wings. Could Goethe guess, just based upon the telecommunication systems available at that time, that there will be such a possibility like this in the 21st century?
Gondolt-e arra, hogy hogyan adhatunk szárnyakat a területnek? Nem hiszem. Még mi sem tudtuk 10 évvel ezelőtt, hogy majd okos telefonok lesznek a zsebeinkben.
Could he, Goethe, think of that he might give wings to this special industry? I don't really think so. We couldn't know ourselves just 10 years ago that today there will be mobile phones, smartphones in our pockets.
De vajon mi tudjuk-e azt, hogy a Goethei szárnyakat hogyan adhatjuk meg a szektornak? Bízom benne, hogy igen.
But the question is whether we know we can give the wings of Goethe to the sector. I am confident that yes, we can.
Európa már régen felismerte, önök már régen felismerték, hogy ezeket a szárnyakat úgy adjuk meg, ha megadjuk a fejlődés lehetőségét. Ennek a gondolatnak a követésében mindig számíthatnak rám, mint szövetségesükre.
Europe has recognized long time ago, and we have also recognized it, that these things can be given to the industry by opening wide the possibilities for development. And following this concept through to reality, you can always count on me as your ally.
Maga a fejlődés azonban több dologtól is függ. Egyrészt függ az emberektől, attól, hogy elfogadják a fejlődés lehetőségét. Ezt akkor fogják megtenni, ha megbízhatnak a piacban, vagyis vannak gyökerek. És attól is függ, hogy a fejlődéssel járó előnyök mindenki számára elérhetőek legyenek.
However, development itself depends on several issues. Partly it depends on people. It depends on whether people accept the possibility of development, and they will choose the route to development if they can have confidence in the market, which means that they do have roots. And this also depends on the advantages involved in development will be available to everyone.
Ennek a biztosítása a mi közös feladatunk. Vagyis be kell lássuk, a digitális gazdaság jövője stratégiai jelentőségű, akár az emberek életminőségének a javításában is. Ez az a szektor, ami az egész világ gazdasági növekedésének a motorját jelenti.
To make certain that this happens, this is our shared task. That is, we must recognize the development of digital economy is of strategic importance, the same way as in the improvement of the quality of life of people. This is the sector, this is the industry which may mean the engine of the world economic growth.
Ebben van tehát a versenyképesség kulcsa. Egy modern hatóság feladata pedig az, hogy megteremtse a fejlődés feltételeit.
So this is the key to competitiveness. The task of a modern authority is to create conditions for development.
A fejlődés feltételei és lehetőségei azonban nem csak a felhasználókat, vagyis az embereket érintik, vagyis nem csak az ő befogadási lehetőségeiktől és képességüktől függ. A fejlődés csak akkor lehetséges, ha párbeszédet tudunk folytatni azokkal, akik ezt megvalósítják, vagyis magukkal a befektetőkkel és a piaci szereplőkkel.
However, the conditions and possibilities of development have an impact not only on the users, that is people, which means they also depend on the adoption capabilities and possibilities of these people. Development will be possible only if we can pursue dialogue with those who implement this development, i.e. with the investors and with the market players.
Éppen ezért nagy jelentőségűnek tartom, hogy itt Budapesten nem csak a szabályozói oldal, hanem a befektetési szektor, a gazdasági elemzők és a telekommunikációs cégek képviselői is megjelennek, hiszen, mint mondtam, a gyakorlati megvalósítás éppen annyira fontos, mint a kiszámítható környezet megteremtése.
Therefore, I find it extremely important that here in Budapest, not only the representatives of the regulatory authorities, but also the experts and the professionals from the investment industry, the economic analysts, and the representatives of the telecommunication companies are also present. As I said, practical implementation is just as important as to create a predictable environment.
Hölgyeim és uraim, azért is nagy jelentőségű a párbeszéd itt a 21. század elején, mert most dől el, hogy Európa fejlődése versenyképes lesz-e a többi földrészen történő fejlődéshez viszonyítva. Most dől el, hogy sokat bíróak lesznek-e a gyökerek, vagyis a közös érdekeken és az egyedi igényeken stabilan állunk-e majd.
Ladies and gentlemen, this dialogue here in the beginning of the 21st century is of great significance, because it is decided here and now whether European development is going to be competitive compared to the growth and competitiveness in the other continents. It is decided here and now whether the roots will be strong enough, whether we can stand in a strong way on the shared interest and also on the individual interests.
És most dől el az is, sokat bíróak lesznek-e a szárnyak, vagyis a fejlődés abban az ütemben és olyan irányban halad-e, amely kézzelfogható eredményeket jelent a jövőben. Bízom abban, hogy ezekre a kérdésekre hamarosan megkapjuk az igenlő választ.
It is also decided here and now whether the wings can carry the load, whether the development is going to proceed in the direction and by the speed which would bring tangible results in the future. I'm confident that very soon we shall have the affirmative loud yes to all these questions.
Addig is azonban van miről beszélnünk, van miért tennünk. Ezúton is köszönöm mindnyájuknak a jelenlétet és az elkötelezett munkát. Hasznos építő tanácskozást kívánok a mai napra, és azt, hogy együtt fogadjuk meg őt a szavait, vagyis adjunk gyökereket és szárnyakat. Köszönöm szépen a tisztelő figyelmüket.
Until this happens, we have so many things to speak about and so many things we must do. This is also the point where I would like to thank you very much and express my appreciation for your presence, for your attendance and the committed work. May I wish ourselves very useful, constructive discussions and also that we can abide by Goethe's words. That is, we should give roots and wings. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Kanellos, for those lovely words. I think we will be discussing roots and wings throughout the day. I think we will follow up with Dr. Leonidas Kanellos, the chairman of the body of European telecom regulators, BEREC, who is running the mandate until the end of the year, so the last plenary of Trendy, and I think we have some interesting insights from your year and the lead of BEREC to share this. Please.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, European Telecom, a trend investment target again. Let me provide you the answers within my speech, which is going to be very brief. It will last only for 5 hours, which is definitely less than the ones of General Castro some years ago in the central square of Havana. When at the beginning of the year we planned for a workshop on investment in the European telecom sector, we were acutely aware of the relevance and importance of the topic. In fact, creating an investment-friendly environment in Europe is a major part of our existence as European regulators. How to achieve this goal will be the subject matter of today's conference, which is perfectly organized by our Hungarian colleagues in this beautiful city of Budapest. I'm therefore glad that we regulators will have the opportunity to to exchange views with representatives of the industry, from financial and investment institutions, as well as from the market research and advisory sector. This grand set can shed new light into our common pursuit of a vibrant European ICT industry. As Benjamin Franklin used to say, an investment in knowledge pays the best interest. Let me briefly highlight the trends of the emerging digital ecosystem. The political agenda widely recognizes that the smoothly functioning digital market would serve as a positive beacon for the development of the European economy as a whole. The emerging digital ecosystem, ladies and gentlemen, turns the globe into a large interconnected neighborhood, which is characterized by user mobility, by universal broadband coverage, and ubiquitous communications. Smart devices using sensors enable new forms of communication with the user, with the environment, and with other machines. Smart applications open new possibilities in education, healthcare, entertainment, communication, and radically transform all aspects of our social and professional lives. However, in order for these innovative applications using digital data to constantly and seamlessly reach each one of us, a robust network infrastructure is required all over Europe. High-speed broadband networks, fixed, like fiber to the cabinet or fiber to the home, and mobile, 4G LTE, providing adequate capacity to carry big volumes of data, should be made available everywhere, for everyone, and at affordable prices. In this dynamic environment, if we want Europe to play an active role in the future developments, major investments are needed for NGA network deployment, along with appropriate regulatory policies and measurable objectives as those set by the Digital Agenda 2020. As BEREC has pointed out in a number of occasions, Europe must continue to move forward and not fall behind. Europe must reform in order to adapt to changing times, ensuring the optimal conditions for its economy and ultimately for the prosperity of its citizens. Indeed, the rising new era generates disruptive and transformative changes in market, economy, and society. New professions are created, new business models emerge, new standards of social behavior are set, and new regulatory paradigms are required. Let me explore with you the ways to redefine the rules of the game. To ensure a smooth transition to the new era, it is necessary to properly redefine the rules of the game for government, industry, investors, businesses, and citizens. This task ultimately remains with policymakers and regulators who are constantly invited to implement high-level political decisions into concrete market rules, effectively balancing conflicting interests at stake, and being capable to attract investment while safeguarding competition. In Europe, we need to ask ourselves what concrete actions are necessary in order to turn the European ICT industry into a rising star of the game. It is an undisputable fact that the performance of the electronic communications sector heavily relies not only on regulation, but on a number of important other factors, these including inter alia, administrative and commercial law frameworks, tax regimes, network dynamics, attractiveness of the electronic communications sector as opposed to other sectors, and access to capital, which is particularly vital in the present economic conditions. From our perspective, one particularly relevant question is to explore the changes necessary to our regulatory framework. Our existing sophisticated framework in Europe has, without any doubt, produced so far innovation, competition, and affordable consumer prices. But we have to accept that it also needs to adapt to a rapidly changing environment. Let me then briefly highlight the BEREC role as a tool for regulatory consistency and harmonization. In this direction, we do believe that the role of the Board of European Regulators for Electronic Communications is pivotal towards providing high-level expertise, ensuring better coordination between stakeholders, and harmonized implementation of European rules across national markets. As an independent body, deriving from a novel institutional design, BEREC has indeed proven a powerful tool for consistency and greater harmonization in Europe. through the process of the RFP 7 and 7A. BEREC faces the regulatory challenges arising in the new digital ecosystem by providing expert advice on new policies related to investment, to the creation of a digital single market, to the transition from ex-ante regulation to competition law via non-discrimination mechanisms and adequate costing methodologies. Our experts also keep on analyzing issues such as net neutrality, consumer protection, accessibility to the information society for disabled users, machine-to-machine communications, and so on. Our view is that policymakers have to apprehend the complementary role of the various regulatory jurisdictions in order to achieve a holistic response to the challenges ahead. For instance, the impact of legitimate expectations of national ministers of finance from high usage fees deriving from spectrum auctions has to be assessed against the financial stability and the overall investment capability of mobile operators, a fact that will in turn reflect on the retail consumer prices asked from consumers for the new services. In a broader perspective, we have to explore synergies between various regulatory bodies. For instance, the cooperation of regulators for electronic communications with competition authorities, as well as with institutions dealing with privacy and security, will contribute to the effective and coherent regulation of the entire new digital ecosystem. Coordination will reduce conflicts or overlaps between various competencies. Facilitating one-stop shop procedures and infrastructure sharing schemes for both fixed and mobile network operators and marketplace operating Europe and globally, Europe-wide and globally, is a key factor to reduce network rollout and sales delivery costs. To reignite interest in the European digital economy and promote an investment-friendly environment, real commitment is needed from policymakers, regulators, and the industry players. In other words, we need not only to talk the talk, but definitely to walk the walk. We at BEREC maintain that the challenge for the legal and regulatory environment is to provide stability, predictability, and long-term perspective for the investors, while it also needs to be flexible, sense the pulse of the market, and constantly adapt to the changing circumstances of our industry. Our vision should comprise the adoption of a human-friendly technology which will become a useful tool for the citizen, enabling him to grow, to get educated, to work creatively, and progress. I look forward to a lively and productive discussion that will weapon our brain with the silver bullets on how to effectively foster investments in the European ICT industry. Thank you all for your attention and for your contribution to the success of this event.
Thank you, Dr. Kanellos. I think today we're still talking the talk and look forward to seeing you walk the walk as well. Now we have Harald Gruber, who runs the Media and Telecoms unit at the European Investment Bank and has been highly involved in many of these discussions for this time. So please.
Thank you. Morning, Mr. President. Thank you for inviting me to this very timely and to-the-point conference. The title of the conference, I think, is very, very appropriate for the times that are now. I mean, the question whether telecommunications sector is still worth to be financed in Europe, I think it's a very crucial question, because we believe that broadband infrastructure is terribly needed for the European economy. So there's a very strong economic needs. And we are faced with the fact that on one hand, you see that there are huge quantities of capital floating around in the world looking for investment opportunities, because interest rates are very low, so people are trying to allocate the floating around capital. On the other hand, Europe needs investment in this infrastructure. And so why is this not happening? And one of the main thread of my talk will be to unravel some aspects related to this. Now, the European Commission, it has set up a very useful policy target. It has clearly identified what is needed, what are the needs to basically provide the European Union with a capillary broadband access network. Now, I will show that this well-defined policy goal has a cost, and that in principle this is something that the European Union can afford. But it has to think about how to finance it. And as we go along, we'll see how things. Oh, it was too fast. Now, first of all, it is among experts, it's an undisputed fact that broadband infrastructure leads to productivity growth. It's a key ingredient for productivity growth. And productivity growth is basically the key to economic welfare, to preserving the living standards of Europe. Europe is proud of having a very high living standard, and this needs to be sustained by strong productivity growth. Otherwise, this standard of living cannot be maintained, it's not sustained, and Europe will suffer of deterioration of its economic standards and its position in the world economy. Now, broadband is one of the keys for achieving productivity growth. And next generation networks play a crucial role in this. Now, here, this graph plots a few correlations which shows that basically there's a significant positive correlation between broadband penetration and economic growth. And the reason is also that broadband penetration leads to more innovative industry, more innovative economies, and therefore to more growth. Now, broadband, therefore, is what we would consider as the backbone of the knowledge economy, because basically we are, in the 21st century we have economies, advanced economies are based on knowledge, of information sharing, and getting new ways of providing information and using information. Now, to set up a capillary broadband infrastructure in Europe, the European Commission has set up some targets. Basically, by 2020, high-speed broadband should be available for basically to everybody, which is broadband speed of 30 megabits per second and above, and at least 50% of the population should adopt high-speed services in excess of 100 megabits per second. Now, this is a sort of a technical target. I mean, as always, this technical target, technological targets, has several ways to get around it. I mean, we can achieve a technical target through different means. The devil is always in the detail. So we can have a bill for this which ranges between some 70 billion euros to 220 billion euros. So it depends on the performance of the network. Whereby the minimum requirements of the digital agenda are in any case met. Now, we have proceeded to a very detailed calculation of different technology deployment scenarios for the different European countries. And so we have computed what are the costs. Now, we came also to the conclusion, doing some more work, that in principle, these are costs that the European economy can support. These are sustainable costs. Moreover, these costs are easily recouped by the future benefits in terms of economic growth that will derive from this technology deployment. Now, the problem is that the markets, as very often with infrastructure, will go only for the juicy bits, which means it will go for areas where there's high population density, and therefore a broader network can be rolled out at costs where the investor can recoup it quite easily in terms of not too far away profits. So we have calculated what are the areas where basically the normal market forces would provide the sufficient infrastructure. And it's typically it's urban areas. I will give you later a little bit more of the details. Basically it's about 1/3 of this bill I've showed you earlier, which should be achieved through so it will be done basically by operators or companies or private investors without too many additional incentives. It's just mere market forces will provide for it. But 2/3 of the rollout would not happen just like this. So it requires varying degrees of public support. Even it could be a little bit of helping in access to finance, to outright grants, because especially in scarcely populated areas, if you want to set up their broadband telecommunication infrastructure, it needs quite a high degree of grant contribution. Now, how does this work? I mean, this plot should in some way somehow illustrate how these factors work. We know that simply from the topology of the European economy, that about 50% of the population live in sort of urban agglomerations, where basically, which we would refer to as previously as black areas. So the thing is that it's about 20% of the infrastructure cost would be allocated to this 50% of population. But the more you go towards the less densely populated areas, so for instance, if you go to what we are calling suburban areas, which are in density between 100 and 500 people per square kilometer, there you can see that about 1/3 of the population lives there, and you would need to allocate about 1/3 of the capex for the infrastructure to this type of areas. And then you have the more difficult part, which is referred to the rural population, which is about 20% of the rural population, which lives in areas which have less than 100 inhabitants per square kilometer. But it accounts for about half of the cost to roll out. So you can see the tension that arises here from basically giving universal access to the broadband infrastructure and the cost of the provision for this. Now, since we are not anymore in an old world where basically we had monopolies, we could have some sort of subsidy, cross-subsidies, since you cannot work that easily with this kind of old tools, which you had very first telecommunication networks were set up. So you have to, in some way, work with more sophisticated tools to provide the financing for especially for those scarcely populated areas. Now, it's a little bit similar to what I have just said, just now relating it to how this can be financed. I mean, the essential thing for instance, if you take the high-speed broadband network, so basically it's a sort of the most advanced network, which is fiber to the home, which is basically what is considered to be as the most advanced technology in terms of provision of broadband services, and which is so-called future-proof. So you can be pretty sure that it will also last for 20 or more years. You can see that it is essential what is the rollout cost per subscriber. Now, in urban areas, as mentioned it before, I mean, it's by its nature that the unit cost, because you have tremendous economies of scale in the rollout, you can see that it is considerably below, or it is at least at the level where it is considered to be financial by sheer market forces. So there's a sort of a threshold which can be around 500, 600 euros, whereby you shouldn't have too many problems. Then you have the area, basically in the suburban areas, where you could have quite a large range of per unit costs. And I mean, there clearly some of that can still be sort of considered to be as financially viable simply by private operators. And then you have the parts where you need different degrees of support from the public sector. Now, the thing is that by looking at this one, we just look at the financial profitability. So it's the profitability, the profits that the investor is reaping. It ignores somehow the broader economic benefits that, for instance, accrue to a local community or to a society in the wider sense in terms of productivity growth. And these economic benefits, clearly the public sector needs to take into account. So it has a broader set of benefits that has to be taken into account, and therefore it has a broader scope for having an economic rationale to support such an infrastructure than just the narrow scope of financial profitability. Now, this is basically, these are the key ingredients when you have to face a financing decision concerning the rollout of a broadband infrastructure. You typically look, first of all, at three categories. You look at the capital expenditure, how much does it cost? And we have unraveled that to some degree. We see that some are something that are, especially in urban areas, that are relatively low, but they can be quite high. Then you have the revenue part, which is also a tricky item, which I haven't talked to you before about. It is basically what you can expect that subscribers are prepared to pay a month on a monthly basis for having access to this infrastructure. I mean, this infrastructure is provided in competition also, perhaps with also other opportunities to provide the same service. So, I mean, is there some degree of ability that high-speed broadband has a price premium compared to an already existing infrastructure? So it's the kind of considerations that need to be taken into account. Now, Europe, this is one of the major issues for broadband rollout. Europe has been tremendously successful in having low prices for broadband access. If you compare to Europe across broadband access price in the world, you will find that Europe is in the lower end. So European consumers are getting a tremendously good deal for provision of broadband services. This is probably one of the merits of the European Commission's effort in basically regulating the market in such a way that consumer prices have been induced as low. The flip side, of course, is that the investment incentives have been somehow mitigated by, or have lowered by that. So basically, you will find that investors, they are considering this as a highly competitive market with potentially relatively low upsides, and therefore they could consider this as something that is very risky, and they would look at investment opportunities which have a higher degree of upside. So that's one of the revenue parts. And then there's the operational side. There, basically, the competition I was just talking about has introduced that European operating costs are, European operators, they are efficient in that sense, so that basically operating costs are relatively low, and one would expect that the new infrastructure would not have a completely different profile of its operating costs. And then clearly, in the investment decision, what you have to take account of is clearly the time horizon of the infrastructure that you take into account. Now, if normally an investor, which is operating in competitive markets, they typically have a time horizon which does not go very much beyond 10 years. And therefore, they have to somehow recoup the investments within that time frame. So clearly, if you would be able, for some reason, to broaden this investment horizon, basically say, if you could put the investment proposition something like that's more similar to a utility, where you typically have this regulated market, but which are less affected by sort of competitive forces, and therefore they are considered to be as somehow for private investors safer, and perhaps even very low risk investors like pension funds could invest. So these are investments that typically have a time horizon in excess of 10. They could be easily 15 years. So if you could manage to put the framework for investments for this infrastructure in such a time frame, you could get much more investors into such infrastructures. Now, as I said, it's a little bit a repetition. I mean, one of the key things is bringing down the capex. You can do that through different types of features, being very efficient in the rollout, getting all kinds of support from local communities in getting access and helping in the civil engineering type of activities. Then clearly, as mentioned before, it depends very much also on the technology choice. The build of the rollout varies depending on the technology. On the revenue side, as said, it is very important that investors are somehow comforted that consumers appreciate the service. Potentially they are prepared also to pay a premium price for access to high-speed services. And there is also scope, probably from the public sectors, to induce new services which require, to benefit from those services, this kind of infrastructure, high-speed infrastructure. I mean, you can only think about, what could potentially be done for instance, in an aging society in terms of the provision of social services. If you would have high-speed access services which would allow to monitor elderly people living alone in their homes. So without having, so you could some way have a sort of a monitoring program for those kind of people, which would allow sort of autonomous living as long as possible, which would perhaps be a win-win for both the people affected and also for the public sector, which has to provide the service. Other things, for instance, are now bringing down the operational costs. I mean, this can be done through all kinds of sharing agreements on the network, and exploitation to the largest extent of possible of the economies of scale. And of course, you would also have the financing component. You would need to have an appropriate mix of private and public funding in a way to achieve the rollout in those what I've mentioned as great and wide areas. Now, a little bit on what the EIB is doing in this field. EIB, it is the bank, European Investment Bank is the bank owned by the member states of the European Union. And shareholders expect, which are the shareholders of the bank are the member states, and they expect that the bank contributes to achieving European policy goals, broadband rollout, the digital agenda is clearly one of the policy goals. And therefore, it is high on the agenda of the bank. The bank is doing, in quantitative terms, quite a lot for it. It provides, here you see it on the graph, it provides 1.5 to 2 billion of loans to the sector, direct loans. This ignores also all the various types of indirect funding through equity funds and through intermediated funding through global loans. And there has been, over the last 2 years, a considerable step up of the activities. Last year, it achieved 2.5 billion. This year, we expect to end the year with a similar amount. So basically, the bank is providing a substantial funding to the industries for broadband rollout. And it's for both mobile and for fixed technologies, broadband technologies. Now, this is just an example of the type of the projects that the bank has financed in the past, the type of promoters. You can see it involves a broad range of operators, both public and private, small and big. So the bank tries to accommodate the needs of a broad range of investor profiles. Now, clearly, what are the typical instruments of the bank? I mean, for the bank is financing the large corporates in the sense that it's providing corporate funding for the rollout of broadband infrastructure. We do also project finance, so it's basically the financing provided to what is called a ring-fenced operation, in the sense that the risk is taken on the infrastructure of itself. So it is a proposition for investors whereby they don't have, the investors have as only security the project itself. We finance, of course, the public sector in the rollout of, especially at local level, the rollout of broadband networks. And we have, through our partner banks, intermediated structures for funding of broadband projects. We help also infrastructure funds in providing funding for broadband networks. And we are developing in cooperation with the European Commission new financial instruments that somehow leverage Commission grant funding with loan products in a way to ease the funding, especially in the gray areas of mentioned before. Okay, now, as a rule, the EIB funds up to 50% of the project cost as defined by the EIB, and if grants elements are involved, grants from the European Commission, the total fund, the combined fund between grants and EIB loans can go up to 90% of the project cost. There are a number of benefits for the beneficiaries. You can read them up. So basically, there is a relatively good interest rate, but also what is very important is the maturities of the loan. So it's the long-term funding, which very much matters to investors and which the bank is able to provide. On top of it is basically also the strong technical expertise that the bank has. The bank has quite an important staff in the telecommunications sectors, and once the bank approves or is about to finance a project, it has a very strong signaling effect to the other investors, and they ease very often the financing conditions to the investor. So, just as a conclusion, the investment bill for digital agenda is quite big, but it is something that the European Union can afford, and moreover, it is worth be financed because the economic benefits deriving from it by far outpace the cost of this infrastructure. And I mean, the thing is now that there are a number of challenges which I set out, both in terms of optimizing the capital expenditure, but also in providing sufficient grounds for the revenue, in a way that most of the funding can be provided through the revenues paid by the user. And the EIB is clearly in there to support the rollout of this infrastructure, which is the box of financial instruments. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Gruber. That was great to see how the EIB fits into the picture. I'm mindful of time, but I'm not going to sacrifice a good discussion for pushing ahead. So we're going to have the next panel in a moment, but I know that Leonidas, you had a question, and we might want to see whether things need to be cleared up or questions asked. So, Leonidas.
Thank you, Magnus. I have a question for Harald, which is namely the following. Some 2 or 3 years ago, I understand that the European Investment Bank has conducted a survey so as to define the financing needs of achieving the digital agenda targets. And you have defined the financing requirements of the digital agenda ranging from 70 to 220 billion euros, if I'm not mistaken, depending on how you define the digital agenda goals. For instance, how do you define the speeds, the access speeds? Are they guaranteed? Are they defined on a best effort basis? How do you define the households? And so on and so forth. This fact, combined to the fact that the broadband funding has been reduced by the European Commission, European Parliament. We were expecting to have at least 7.2 billion devoted to broadband deployment, and as you know, this has been reduced to 1 billion. So my question to you, Harald, is how do you estimate this investment gap being bridged? And do you estimate that, taking into account the current conditions, is there any chance to achieve the digital agenda goals as initially defined, or should we redefine them and adapt them to a more pragmatic approach?
No, I think you address a very valid point. I mean, the fact that one thing is to basically to elaborate political targets. The other is then to put money behind it. I think, I was a little bit sorry about the fact that the European Council decided to significantly, as you mentioned, cut the resources for the funding of broadband infrastructure. And clearly this is also a signaling that there are a number of important topics in the European Union to be financed, but broadband apparently is not the most important one, or one of the most important ones. They found scope for cutting that. But nevertheless, the bank, as I mentioned to you before, is here because it had a capital increase, and within this capital increase, clearly, as you have seen, there was also a step up of funding for the broadband sector. So the additional capital that the Connecting Europe facility would have provided in its original shape would have been very, very good, because it could have topped up even more the funding from the European Investment Bank, because that was one of the ideas that the European Commission would basically jointly finance with the EIB additional funding. So it would not be replacing funding that the European Investment Bank is already doing, it would be a top up. Now, clearly, with this 1 billion, which has now been decided, only a very small amount is probably came to be allocated to financial instruments for broadband infrastructure rollout. So, in that sense, I would not say that Europe needs to redefine the agenda. I think, in terms of technological rollout, there is scope for redefining technologies, but not ultimately the targets of having high-speed rollout. What probably you would have envisaged then as a fact of that you may have a little bit of shifting of deadlines by which you could have said mission accomplished. So maybe instead of 2020, it may shift for a few years more to achieve the target. But ultimately, I think the policy target is correct, and it is needed to achieve a certain economic performance.
Thanks for that. Do we have any more questions from the panel? I'm keen to move on, but if there are any pressing questions or clarifications, there is one here. I'm going to take that. And if you can say who you are as well.
In general, let me say that I've heard that regulators and bankers are sitting in the presidium. This is how it should be. And Mr. Gruber is clearly not representing the European Union, but you touched upon a number of questions related to the European Union. And you in your recent response, touched upon the Connected Europe facility. Can we say goodbye to this program? 7 billion was a little more than a rounding error. 1 billion is clearly far below the rounding error in terms of these budgets. Is anything emerging in your view, because something is to come? Otherwise, the 2020 is to be shifted into a very far future, and very soon catching up to Russia can be your quite target, which, how to say, doesn't sound good. Thank you.
As I said before, 7.2 billion would have been a very good quantity. It's not that 1 billion is nothing. It is something. I think what it is basically sort of a core. You can build up a core which you can use then as a leverage to show that something can be achieved with this, and in a way that it mobilizes other funding activities in that sense. So what you have to think about is that you spend it very smartly in a way that you have a sort of a multiplicator effect. So I'm not that negative about it, but it is certainly, it makes life more difficult. That's clear. That's clear. And I think, as you rightly mentioned, that there are other regions in the world which probably they're less hesitant about spending money for such crucial infrastructure. And so Europe, I think, what it should avoid is that basically it should be being overtaken, because Europe was, in the past, it was the leading telecommunication region. Mobile telecommunication wasn't invented in Europe. It was first deployed to a large extent in Europe. So, there is, if you looked 10 years ago, the leading suppliers for equipment were mostly European. So, these things are a little bit shifting, but basically, operators and suppliers, they're going where the market is. So, if there's no investment in town, then companies move. And so, I think there is the clear risk that Europe is losing out.
Thank you again, Harald. I'm keen to press on. The panelists will be around, so do tap them up later, and we'll be talking a lot about investment during the course of the day. So if you have questions that are more general, we'll have plenty of panelists to pick up later in the day. We are in relatively good shape in time, but in absolute terms we're running a bit late, so I'm keen to get the next panel on the podium, and I'd like to thank the first speakers very much. Thank you.